Hi, my name is Sara Emmesjoe, and I've just finished my last year of my forensic investigation course at Stafford University. And my project is about enhancing the understanding, effectiveness, and efficiency of firearm evidence recovery processes within the Swedish Police and the National Forensic Centre. If you have any questions, please email me. My email can be seen in the bottom of this slide. The aim of this research was to understand the current barriers and challenges within the Swedish police and firearm-related crimes. With this research, I want to improve the current procedures to make them more efficient and effective. I collected data from personnel within the Swedish Police and the National Forensic Centre. I carried out a mixed methods approach and interpret data collected using thematic analysis. From that, I compared previous research with data collected to generate recommendations to the Swedish Police. Before the reorganization in 2015, the Swedish Police consisted of 21 separate forces, but after the reorganization, the Swedish Police combined into one force, but with 7 different regions and 25 districts. The forensic provision is within the Swedish Police, and there are 12 different forensic hubs in Sweden, with the biggest one being in Linköping. This is where firearms are examined, and no matter where in the country they are recovered from. There are also forensic stations around the country that are more local at police stations, which are used as triage units, and you can carry out more examinations there that could not be carried out on the crime scene. To become a police officer, you undergo the police program for 2.5 years, which includes modules that are more dedicated to forensic aspects of the job. After that, it is very dependent on role and own initiative on how much training you will have moving on from that. Why I think this research is important is that since 2013, lethal violence caused by firearms in Sweden has increased more than any other country in Europe, and I saw recently in the news that there has been 151 shootings in the 151 days of the year so far. I used a mixed methods approach, which included a questionnaire and semi-structured interviews. SPSS was used on most of the questions from the questionnaire, and Excel was used mostly on the interviews and also open-ended questions from the questionnaire. The data was coded using thematic analysis, and this is where I came up with the 6 themes with the most common topics mentioned by the participants. The questionnaire consisted of 54 mixed-style questions. I received 28 completed questionnaires, and the participants were between 18 to over 56 years old. And I have participants from all regions, but mostly from the Stockholm region, which can be seen in the graph below. The interviews were semi-structured and they were around 30 minutes long. I interviewed 2 investigators, 1 forensic technician, 1 police officer, 1 chief inspector, and 1 police officer in National Operational Management. And in the top graph, you can see what everyone's role were that participated in the questionnaire. 6 themes were identified: the current procedures, low level of firearm and firearm-related evidence knowledge, resources, statements from forensic experts, long waiting times regarding examination of evidence by Emmesjoe, and varied amounts of training regarding firearm and firearm-related evidence. And not to mention interagency working and communication, which play an extremely important part in interagency working and play a part in all 6 themes that I've just mentioned. Now moving on to talking more about each theme individually, starting with the current procedures. Forensic stations are a new addition to the workflow process, and participants mentioned this in a positive way and in a negative way. They saw that this was a new positive addition and that it would help streamline the current processes. But some thought it was a negative addition because it could complicate the submission process in a way that there are so many steps and there could be miscommunication between investigators and forensic technicians in what needs to be done and what not need to be done. The current prioritizing system was also brought up. It does not work because there are just too many cases that are prioritized, which creates long waiting times and restraint on resources. Lastly, forensic technicians were brought up, mainly in the Stockholm region. There were too few and it takes too long for them to come out to a scene. Sometimes due to lack of resources, the forensic technicians will not come out to the scene, which leaves it up to the police officers, which could increase errors and contamination. In a collaboration with Buck University, the Region Stockholm Police and New Jersey State Police, they stated that the forensic technicians in Region Stockholm does not get called out to a great extent where a shooting has occurred and the victim has not died. This again leaves up to police officers to handle evidence which they are not trained to do. I also wanted to mention that in 2017, the EU recommended that every member state should have a national firearm focal point. This is a centre that focuses on firearm and firearm crime, and Sweden does not have that at the moment despite the current situation with the rise in firearm-related violence and crime. Moving on to low level of knowledge. This was specifically seen in the external operation. Aspects where police officers in the external operation displayed low level of knowledge were in evidence handling, understanding the purpose of seized evidence, and the understanding of the investigative process. The low knowledge has led to a lack of consistency in work among police officers, a lack of trust in the police officers in the external operation, and prolonged investigations, according to participants. Participants also had a hard time defining terms like for firearm evidence and ballistic material. There was no standard answer and the variety in the answers were quite wide. They also had a hard time in defining the workflow process for firearm evidence. There are some apps in the UK and in America that help personnel that needs to handle evidence and how to do that. It was mentioned by one participant in this research that there is one in Sweden, but I could not find it. Lastly, NFC was seen as a competent and professional organization, but it was commented by participants that NFC does not understand the investigative work and the investigative aspect of a case. This is from a police perspective due to the fact that I did not have any participants from the National Forensic Center that participated in this research. Moving on to resources. This was shown in two different aspects, that NFC does not have enough personnel and the lack of forensic technicians. To tackle the lack of personnel of NFC, Operation Vilgot started. They hired more people to tackle the waiting times for evidence examinations. The chief inspector for the ballistics group at NFC said in 2021 that they had too much work and that they could not handle the influx, and to hire someone new would take 2.5 years of training, and that is just not enough when dealing with the amount of evidence they have to deal with. So Operation Vilgot was a way around this issue. And as mentioned earlier, with forensic technicians, they are too few and this affects the investigations as well as the whole chain. Statements from forensic experts at NFC was brought up as well, and that the statements produced by the forensic experts were not the same. There was no standard when it comes to statements revolving evidence examinations. They also did not meet the requirements that needed to be met from a prosecution perspective. The information that is needed to convict a suspect are not always included in the expert witness statements given by the forensic experts from NFC. These statements can be hard to understand and be complex, so it's important that people with different backgrounds and not a scientific background can understand these statements. Moving on to long waiting times. Participants in this research expressed that the waiting times for examination of evidence was longer than 3 months mostly. This was carried out during 2021 at the same time as Operation Vilgot. That operation was seen as a success because they reduced the average time to 49 days for evidence examinations, but the participants in this research expressed that the waiting time was much longer than that. Participants displayed clear dissatisfaction regarding the waiting times and that the waiting times really affected the cases they were working on. Sometimes they had to wait so long that they had to release the suspect and they lose the whole case because they've had to wait too long for the evidence. Lastly, training was brought up. It was shown that there was no recurring training, or there was no standard in the type of training that was received. Some people had training once in 20 years. Some other participants might have had training every other year or 3 times in their career. It could be everything from material on the internet to actual courses. Training and information were more often spread spontaneously and not through the police itself, more in the way that when someone taught someone else, they would learn from each other, and learning by doing was more often seen. In a study by Kohlström in 2021, showed findings that police officers do 1 year in the external organization after the police program. The police officers that stayed in the external organization after that year had to do a lot of self-directed training during their career, and the police officer that went on to leadership or specialist roles received formal training. Moving on with the training theme, these 2 graphs shows that police officers receive training on how to recover firearm evidence, but not really in the submission process for firearms. The submission process is a key part of the workflow and cannot be seen as less important or forgotten. So my recommendations are for the Swedish Police to create more training revolving how to handle firearms and firearm-related evidence, to increase communication between different departments and agencies within the Swedish Police Authority, seek funding to train more forensic technicians and forensic experts to tackle the lack of personnel and the long waiting times, and to create standards and templates of how and what should be included in a firearm evidence statement from forensic experts at NFC. So this research is extremely important. Sweden has the highest increasing rate of firearm crime in Europe, and I wanted to approach this by using a mixed methods approach where I identify 6 themes: current procedures, low level of firearm and firearm related evidence knowledge, resources, statements from forensic experts, long waiting times regarding examination of evidence by NFC, and varied amounts of training regarding firearm and firearm related evidence. These 6 themes were further researched and backed up by research from all over the world. And with my results, I came up with 4 recommendations to the Swedish Police. in how to make their current firearm evidence recovery processes more effective and efficient. And these next two slides are my references if anyone wants to read more about this.